For generations, Florida's citrus fields fueled the state's economy and thousands of family dreams. Then in 2025, decades of decline and an unstoppable disease sent production to its lowest point since 1919. As corporate giants pulled out and state leaders faced public outrage, lives and billion-dollar legacies crumbled overnight. But what drove this collapse, and are we being told the whole story? A single bacterium, invisible to the naked eye, brought Florida's citrus empire to its knees. Huanglongbing, known as HLB or citrus greening, invaded groves through the bite of a tiny insect called the Asian citrus psyllid. Once inside a tree, the bacteria travel through the phloem, the system that moves sugars and nutrients from the leaves down to the roots. The infection acts like a slow poison. It blocks the flow of sap, starving branches and roots until leaves yellow, fruit turns bitter and misshapen, and the tree itself withers. There is no cure. Every infected tree becomes a reservoir, spreading the disease further. Even the most careful growers, armed with pesticides and pruning shears, could only slow the inevitable. Infected trees sometimes linger for years, producing less fruit each season until whole groves stand hollow and unproductive. By the time researchers understood the full scope of HLB's attack, the disease had already swept across the state. Scientists traced the first confirmed case in Florida to 2005, but the bacteria likely arrived earlier, moving quietly from tree to tree. The scale of the damage became clear as entire counties watched their harvests shrink. The bacteria's method is relentless. It does not kill quickly, but it ensures that every new flush of growth is weaker than the last. Even replanting offered little hope. Young trees, meant to replace the ones lost, often caught the disease within a year or two, restarting the cycle. Growers faced a future where each season brought more losses and fewer options. The scientific consensus was grim: no treatment, no resistant varieties ready for commercial groves, and no way to stop the psyllids from spreading. The collapse of Florida's citrus was not a sudden disaster, but a slow motion unraveling driven by a disease that could not be seen, stopped, or cured. Florida's citrus output now sits at the lowest level in more than a century. The USDA report for 2024 to 2025 found the state's groves produced just 14.52 million boxes of fruit, less than a tenth of what they yielded during the industry's peak in the late 1990s. For the first time since the 1919 to 1920 season, the number slipped below even the hardest years of past freezes and hurricanes. In the span of a single generation, production has collapsed by more than 90%. 5 years ago, growers shipped out nearly 60 million boxes. Now, each new report brings a fresh drop, with the latest figures showing a 28.5% decline from the previous year alone. Oranges, once the backbone of Florida's agricultural economy, fell to just 12.15 million boxes, down nearly a third from last season. Grapefruit and tangerines barely register, their numbers a fraction of what they once were. The decline is not just statistical. These numbers represent the unraveling of a way of life. Packing houses that once ran around the clock now sit idle for weeks. Equipment dealers and fertilizer suppliers count fewer customers each year. In towns built around the rhythms of the harvest, storefronts are shuttered and schools have fewer students. The sense of security that came from steady yields and generational knowledge has vanished. Each new low in the harvest tally is felt as a blow, not just to business, but to identity and community. With production numbers falling off a cliff, Florida's citrus industry has become acutely vulnerable. Fewer boxes mean thinner margins, and even minor disruptions, weather, pests, or market shifts, can tip the balance from survival to surrender. The latest data has forced even the largest growers to reconsider their future, setting off a wave of decisions that will reshape the land and the people who depend on it. On January 6th, 2025, Alico Inc. released a carefully worded press statement. The company, once a cornerstone of Florida's citrus sector, announced it would cease citrus operations after the close of the 2024 to 2025 harvest. The CEO, John Kiernan, described the move as a strategic transformation. The message was clear. This was not a surrender, but a calculated decision after more than a century in the business. Kiernan's statement emphasized 2 years of internal planning and consultation with stakeholders. The company's leadership pointed to the relentless pressures of citrus greening, hurricanes, and shrinking margins. In public, the CEO framed the exit as a pivot, an opportunity to reposition Alico's extensive land holdings for what he called greater shareholder value. The announcement mentioned a shift toward land monetization and development, highlighting projects already in the pipeline, like the Corkscrew Grove Villages in Collier County. The press release avoided any mention of layoff numbers or the fate of workers. Instead, it focused on the vision for Alico's future, outlining plans for conservation areas, mixed-use communities, and partnerships with state agencies. The company cited the Rural Land Stewardship Area Program, promising environmental stewardship alongside new development. Kiernan closed his remarks by thanking the Alico citrus team for their dedication. The subtext was unmistakable. Florida's largest citrus grower was leaving the industry behind. This public announcement, with its language of transformation and foresight, became the first official link in a chain of documents that would soon detail the impact on the workforce and the communities that depended on Alico's groves. The first details about job losses arrived not in a press conference, but in a legal filing. On January 8, 2025, Alico submitted a notice to the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission listing the exact numbers. 135 employees would be let go immediately. The document offered no comfort, only a list of positions and a date. For hundreds of workers, the end came without ceremony. Crews who had spent years tending groves found themselves out of work with a single document. There were no speeches in the packing houses, no gatherings in the fields, just a sudden stop to routines that had defined entire communities. A second wave of layoffs was scheduled before the season even finished. By April 1st, 2025, up to 37 more jobs would disappear. The company's language was clinical, avoiding any mention of severance or next steps. For those affected, there was only uncertainty. Some had worked for Alico for decades, their livelihoods tied to the rhythm of the harvest. Others had moved from job to job as the industry contracted, always hoping the next season would be better. The impact stretched beyond the groves. Local businesses that relied on steady paychecks, diners, auto shops, and supply stores braced for the fallout. In towns across DeSoto and neighboring counties, the news traveled quickly. The layoffs were not just numbers on a page. They represented people facing lost income, children whose parents no longer had work, and entire neighborhoods wondering what would come next. The legal notices made it official. The collapse was not just about lost fruit or idle land, but about people forced to start over, often with nowhere to go. Alico's board, facing relentless losses from disease and hurricanes, turned its attention to the value of the land itself. Over 5,500 acres, once carpeted with orange and grapefruit trees, became the centerpiece of a new strategy. Internal documents and investor calls dating back nearly 2 years before the public announcement reveal a careful plan to exit citrus and unlock higher returns. The company's largest single asset, the Corkscrew Grove property in Collier County, covers more than 4,600 acres at the edge of fast-growing suburbs. Appraisers and consultants estimated the total development value of Alico's targeted acreage between $335 million and $380 million. The company filed for a special stewardship district with the state, aiming to transform former groves into mixed-use communities. The first major application, submitted in March 2025, outlined a 1,500-acre East Village with homes, commercial space, and conservation corridors. The plan promised to set aside 6,000 to 7,000 acres for permanent preservation, aligning with Florida's Rural Land Stewardship Area Program. Infrastructure funding would come through a partnership with the Department of Transportation, while wildlife crossings and water management projects were pitched as public benefits. Alico's leadership described these moves as a win for shareholders and the environment, but the numbers told another story. Monetizing the land would generate more in 5 years than citrus had in a decade. The board and major investors, many far from the groves themselves, stood to gain from the pivot. Local governments welcomed new tax revenue and development fees. Meanwhile, the people who worked the land, pickers, caretakers, and support staff, were left to wonder what would become of their communities as the fields changed hands. The land, once a source of generational pride and steady work, became an asset to be packaged, sold, and transformed for a different future. In Hardy County, the Alvarez family sits at a kitchen table crowded with unpaid bills and unopened mail. 4 generations have lived on this land, each season marked by the first blossoms and the last fruit picked. Now, the rows of orange trees that once paid for weddings, college, and Christmas are mostly bare. Maria Alvarez, who took over after her father's stroke, checks the bank balance every morning. The numbers never add up. Her son Daniel tried to find work in construction, but jobs are scarce, and the pay does not stretch far enough. The family's pickup, once used to haul crates of fruit, now sits idle at the edge of a field that might soon be sold for development. Down the road, the Singh family faces a different kind of uncertainty. They arrived in Florida from Punjab in the early 2000s, drawn by the promise of steady work in the groves. Amarjeet, the eldest, managed picking crews for Alico. The layoff notice came without warning, a single envelope handed out after a long day in the fields. Amarjeet's wife, Jaspreet, works part-time at a local diner, but her hours have been cut as fewer customers come through the door. Their children, who once played among the citrus trees, now ask why their father isn't going to work. The future they imagined is slipping away, one paycheck at a time. For field supervisor Rosa Martinez, the collapse of the citrus industry is more than a job loss. It is the end of a community. She spent 20 years organizing crews, making sure harvests ran on time, and helping new workers settle in. Now she drives past shuttered packing houses and empty motels that once housed seasonal pickers. Friends have left for Georgia or Texas, chasing rumors of work in blueberries or pecans. Rosa stays, hoping for a miracle, but each week brings news of another family moving out. The $6.8 billion that citrus once brought to Florida's economy feels like a distant memory. School enrollment is down, churches hold food drives, and local clinics see more patients struggling with stress and depression. In town meetings, frustration and sorrow mingle. Some blame the disease, others the company, and a few hold out hope for new crops or another buyer. But for many, the land is no longer a promise, it is a question. What happens to a place when its purpose disappears? For the families and workers who built their lives around the groves, the answer is still unfolding, written in the empty fields and quiet streets of Florida's citrus country. In Tallahassee, the response to Florida's citrus collapse took the form of budgets, bills, and special districts. The state legislature approved $124.5 million for citrus resilience in the 2025 to 2026 budget, with $100 million earmarked for research into disease-resistant trees and tools to slow the spread of HLB. Another $23.4 million went to the Citrus Commission, tasked with supporting what remains of the industry. Lawmakers describe these allocations as a lifeline, but the numbers tell a different story. With production down more than 90% in a generation, the rescue funds arrived as the industry's foundation was crumbling. Alico's land transition depended on state policy. The company filed for a stewardship district, a special local government entity enabled by Florida law. This district, greenlit by House Bill 4041 and signed by the governor, allowed Alico to finance infrastructure, manage conservation land, and shape development on its terms. Proponents argued the stewardship model balanced growth and preservation, promising thousands of acres set aside for wetlands and wildlife. Critics, however, questioned whether the process favored corporate interests over the public good, especially when former groves became lucrative real estate. Oversight, at least on paper, rested with the 5-member board of the stewardship district. Yet the district's enabling legislation left much of the authority in the hands of landowners, Alico, and its affiliates. Local governments, eager for new tax revenue, welcomed the plans. Conservation groups monitored the promised set-aside areas, but their leverage was limited. For the thousands of workers and families affected by the collapse, the mechanisms of policy offered little in the way of direct relief. No whistleblower memos surfaced from inside the Department of Agriculture or the governor's office. Public records requests turned up no warnings about the pace of the collapse, no internal debates over the stewardship district, and no emergency meetings to address the layoffs. The official line held steady. The decline was the result of disease, weather, and market forces beyond anyone's control. The unanswered question lingered. Who, if anyone, would be held accountable for the unraveling of an industry that had shaped Florida for more than a century? Today, Florida's groves stand at a crossroads where disease, shifting markets, and land development redefine an industry and its communities. As the state pivots, thousands feel the ripple effects, and oversight remains under scrutiny. The future of American agriculture now depends on who learns from these failures and who profits from them. What happens next shapes more than Florida, it shapes the nation's food security. Share your thoughts below.